Where did you get your undergraduate, your master's, and your advanced degree?
I did my undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill and received both my master's and my PhD from the University of Virginia.
I wanted to start by asking you how you and your colleagues got interested in this topic of friendship and romantic relationships in teens.
It's something that I have been interested in since starting psychology classes as an undergraduate student and getting involved in research as a student. And I was a part of a lab that was really interested in looking at the quality of marital relationships. And so that was my first taste of kind of relationship research, and became really interested in how the dynamics of different relationships play out, but then that also made me curious about how people arrive in certain types of relationships, or how the qualities of relationships kind of become what they are. And so was interested in kind of being able to pursue those ideas in graduate school. And joining the research group at UVA, they were already beginning to think about these questions and consider the way different friendships in particular might impact adjustment in later relationships. But what was interesting is I think that it actually took some graduate student initiative to add the romantic relationship piece. I think that it wasn't necessarily on the radar of the research team to begin with, which I find really interesting, because I think as a whole, in the study of the romantic relationships in the teenage years, it hasn't really been kind of studied for terribly long. And I think it had been off the radar for a long time. And so I think it took some people who were kind of a little bit more aware of the importance of those relationships as they were kind of going through them or coming out of them, to think about adding some research on them into the larger study that was going on as well.
Tell me a little bit about this particular research paper. What did you and your colleagues look at, and about how many people did it involve?
It's a study of just under 200 teenagers who we followed from ages 13 all the way through age 30, but also we were able to check in with them at various points along the way. So started when they were 13, but also were able to reassess them when they were 16, again when they were about 18, and then follow up with them again when they were in that kind of 27 to 30 range.
How did you gather your data?
One of the great things about this study is sort of the way in which participants did participate. And what I mean by that is it started when these teenagers were in middle school, and they were recruited from a local middle school and have been, again, kind of followed annually since that time. And they come into the lab and they complete questionnaires, but a really unique feature of this research is that we also have them participate in a number of observational tasks. So we have the opportunity to observe them interacting with their friends or with their parents, or most importantly with their romantic partners, to be able to get a sense of their behavior in a little bit more of a sort of naturalistic context. And oftentimes we can also get information from other important people in our participants' lives about our participants. So we get other people's perspectives on, again, how they're maybe doing in a relationship or doing overall, which we think is a real great kind of added benefit.
What kind of questions did you ask?
We were really interested in kind of starting with an endpoint of how satisfied are our now young adults in their romantic lives. And again, in this age of about 27 to 30. And importantly, we were interested in, again, what we called kind of romantic life. So aware that people are not always necessarily in a romantic relationship, but could nevertheless be comfortable with kind of how life in that realm is going overall. So wanted to get a sense of how they've just felt about how romance was going for them at that point in their lives. And then kind of starting or working backwards, interested in different types of relationships along the way that might predict how well they're feeling about their romantic life later on. And so starting in that early teenage time frame, we were interested in how well the teens thought others would react to them. So this idea of, do I feel like most other kids that I would interact with would kind of receive me positively, and I think that I would be able to get support from them if I sought it? Similarly, how well am I as an early teenager at being able to sort of speak up for myself, to sort of confidently assert my opinion in a situation, and essentially kind of speak my mind when the situation may call for it. And then from there, we followed up to see to what extent teens were and where they were in their social competence a few years later. So this idea of how skilled are our teens at negotiating relationships? Do they have the skills that might help them form relationships and stay in relationships a little bit later during the teenage years? And then beyond that, a couple years later, looked at, well, how successful have they been in forming those friendships? So how close are they, or what is the level of closeness they have with their friends currently? How long have they been in those friendships? So really trying to get a sense of, have these teens been able to establish close friendships across this period of early to mid to late adolescence, and wanting to see to what extent those qualities would predict the satisfaction with romantic life.
You talked about those skills that teenagers are starting to develop. Can you name some of those?
I want to key in on one of the first ones I spoke about, which was this idea of asserting oneself in circumstances where that might be particularly called for or also particularly difficult. So, of course, during the teenage period, there can be a lot of pressure to follow the crowd and adopt one's behavior to the prevailing attitude or behaviors of those around them. And so we're interested in to what extent, again, teens might be able to maybe speak out against prevailing norms if it did not feel right for them to perhaps follow them. And again, just to be able to speak up and assert themselves in a social context. And that's one that I think we've seen in other research that has been a particularly useful and important skill that carries forward in different relationships. It seems really important to be able to again share one's opinion and express one's wants and needs in a relationship, even when it might feel difficult to do so sometimes. So that's one skill that we were particularly interested in and kind of thought would be important for later relationships. Other skills, again, I spoke to this idea of closeness of relationships, and I think one of the things we keyed in on was how well our teens were able to form what I would call more intimate relationships. And so oftentimes that might mean that teens are willing to disclose more personal thoughts or feelings to a friend, and to confide in their friends, again, perhaps about more difficult or personal aspects of their lives. And again, anticipating that being able to do so would be important for future romantic life as well.
Tell me a little bit about the findings. Are you still following this group of people for another study?
It's an ongoing study, and so we've continued to reassess these folks beyond what where this study stopped at age 30. I think they're about 33 or 34 now, and really interested in examining how some of these early social factors are also impacting their physical health going forward. Again, I think that at the same time, what we've been able to do has been really, really, I think really valuable in being able to follow the same people over a long period of time to be able to see how things kind of change and develop.
What do these findings suggest to you and your colleagues?
One of the main takeaways that was really interesting to us was that in addition to looking at these different markers of sort of friendship, or as I said, ability to sort of speak one's mind in the context of relationships, we also did include some measures of our teens' romantic experiences as well, to be able to get a sense of how much those types of experiences might matter for predicting future romantic life. And one of the key things we found was that behaviors like previous dating experiences or previous relationship quality, physical attractiveness, didn't have any bearing on how satisfied our teens and now adults were with their romantic life. It was really this friendship domain that seemed to be most predictive of how folks are feeling about their romantic life later on. And so it really suggests to us that being able to again, have this to learn and demonstrate skills that are useful for forming and staying in friendships really seem to be a great sort of maybe practice or proving ground for maybe how things will go in your future romantic relationships. And what makes sense to us is that it's these, especially late adolescent friendships, are great opportunities for closeness and intimacy to develop that are going to be integral parts of later romantic life, versus dating experiences in adolescent tend to be a bit more fleeting and not necessarily based on, at least at first, interest in necessarily developing intimacy and closeness, but perhaps relationships starting, again, based on mutual attraction or common interests, and just sort of for the opportunity to experience a dating relationship. And it may be that the real important work that's being done is occurring in these friendships, and that's what's going to translate ultimately to how satisfied people are later on.
You and your colleagues focused on same-gender friendships. In what ways did you feel or find that that was different than platonic friendships?
It's really interesting that in our study, our participants had the opportunity to bring in, again, their best friend, or the person they considered to be their closest friend, and the overwhelming majority, over I think like 93% at every point, chose to bring in a same-gendered friend. And what I think is really interesting about that is that in the context of dating and romantic relationships, those really tend to come out of friendships that occur between opposite sex friends and friend groups. And so it's really interesting that it's these, at least in our study, these same-gendered friendships, the closeness of them, that was predicting our later romantic satisfaction. And so it may be, again, that having more of the opposite sex friends helps in terms of facilitating those other aspects of kind of adolescent romance I talked about, starting relationships, getting some initial experience in that domain. But again, it seems like perhaps these same-gendered friendships that have persisted over a long period of time have created more opportunities for closeness that just kind of knowing someone for a long time tends to bring. Our participants have felt perhaps more comfortable over time, sharing within the context of a relationship that they've been in and known for a number of years, as opposed to maybe a more recently developed opposite sex friendship, which again tends to kind of come online a little bit later in adolescence to begin with. So it seems like perhaps, again, it's just a bit of a natural setting for these I guess, again, skills around like intimacy and closeness that seems to be really helpful during this time period.
Do you have any suggestions, maybe things that parents can watch for in their kids' friendships, or give positive feedback if they see it, skills that might, again, later lead to positive romantic relationships?
One thing that comes to mind is during, again, mid and late adolescence, teenagers understandably become very interested and excited about the idea of starting to date and having romantic experiences. And one thing I think about for parents is perhaps in the context of that, perhaps kind of gently reminding or encouraging their teens to not let that excitement kind of overshadow the importance of continuing to pay attention to their friendships as well. That, from what we know about this research, again, continuing to have and maintain and grow and kind of have closeness in those friendships is what's going to perhaps be particularly important down the line. And I think, again, as teens tend to get caught up in ideas of dating and romance, there's a tendency, or at least a chance, for friendships to take a bit of a back seat at times. And I think parents can do well to encourage their children and their teenagers to continue to nurture those friendships as well. I think so another thing that could be helpful, again, I've spoken to this idea about learning how to assert oneself and speak one's mind in the context of difficult situations. And I think that's something parents can help their teens with too, by kind of within the context of their own relationship, being willing and open and wanting to hear teens' opinions and what they have to say about situations going on in their lives or places where there might be disagreements. And so giving them opportunities to practice reasoning their way through disagreements and sharing their opinions in the context of conflict or disagreement, again, is something that is probably going to be useful down the line in their friendships and their romantic relationships.